The morning mist clung to the scarred landscape like a shroud. But Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Curry could see death written in every shell crater and twisted strand of barbed wire that stretched before him. Vimy Ridge loomed in the distance, its 7-mile length crowned with German machine gun nests that had already claimed over 100,000 French and British lives in previous failed assaults. It was March 1917, and the ridge had become a symbol of everything wrong with the Great War. For 2.5 years, the Germans had transformed the strategic high ground in northern France into what military experts called an impregnable fortress. The Sixth Army, under Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, had carved a honeycomb of tunnels, got bunkers and observation posts into the chalky limestone, creating overlapping fields of fire that could cut down attacking forces before they reached the first line of trenches. The Canadian Corps, under the command of Lieutenant General Julian Byng, had been tasked with what many considered impossible: capture Vimy Ridge, where others had failed so catastrophically. Unlike the hurried, poorly coordinated attacks that had preceded them, the Canadians were preparing something unprecedented in the annals of warfare. Major General Arthur Curry, commanding the 1st Canadian Division, stood in the forward trenches, examining detailed maps that showed every German position, every communication trench, every potential weakness in the enemy's defenses. The preparation had been meticulous beyond anything previously attempted on the Western Front. For 4 months, Canadian engineers had been digging tunnels beneath no man's land, some extending over 2,000 feet toward German lines. According to historical accounts from the Canadian War Museum, the ridge's significance extended far beyond its tactical value. Whoever controlled Vimy Ridge controlled the WWII Plain, the industrial heartland of occupied France. From its heights, German artillery observers could direct devastating fire on Allied positions for miles around, making any significant advance in this sector virtually impossible. The German defenders, primarily from the 6th Army's 1st Guard, Reserve Division and elements of the 17th Reserve Division, had good reason for confidence. Their defensive system consisted of 3 main lines, each progressively stronger than the last. The first line, known as the Zwischenstellung, contained the forward trenches and strong points. Behind it lay the Hauptkampflinie, the main battle line with its deep bunkers and command posts. Finally, the Rückstellung formed the rear defensive line. It's designed to catch any attackers who might somehow breach the first 2 barriers. Lieutenant Colonel Curry moved through the communication trenches, observing the final preparations. Canadian sappers had constructed an elaborate network of subways and tunnels that would allow troops to move forward without exposure to enemy fire. Ammunition dumps had been positioned at calculated intervals, and field kitchens were preparing hot meals that would be carried forward to the assault troops. The most revolutionary aspect of the Canadian plan was its emphasis on detailed reconnaissance and intelligence gathering, like previous attacks that relied on overwhelming force and hoped for the best. Every Canadian battalion commander had studied scale models of their specific objectives. Captured German prisoners had provided invaluable information about defensive positions, while aerial reconnaissance flights had photographed every square yard of the ridge's surface. As darkness fell over the battlefield, the final artillery pieces were being positioned. The Canadian Corps had assembled over 983 guns, ranging from light field pieces to massive 15-inch howitzers. The bombardment plan called for a week-long preliminary barrage followed by a precisely timed, creeping barrage that would advance. Just ahead of the infantry assault, the stage was set for what would become one of the most meticulously planned and brilliantly executed battles in military history, forever changing how the world viewed the young Dominion of Canada. The rumble of artillery had become as constant as breathing for the men of the N. Canadian Corps huddled in their forward positions. During the first week of April 1917, Private Robert Mackenzie of the 42nd Battalion crouched in a dugout carved from the chalky soil, cleaning his Ross rifle for the 100th time while shells shrieked overhead in their deadly arc toward German positions. The preliminary bombardment had begun on Easter Monday, March 26th, and had continued without pause for 7 days and nights. Over 1 million shells had been fired at German positions. But this was not the random destruction that had characterized earlier offensives. Under the direction of Lieutenant Colonel Andrew McNaughton, Canadian gunners were executing the most sophisticated artillery plan ever conceived: counter-battery. Fire had systematically targeted German artillery positions, guided by and flash-spotting techniques that McNaughton had pioneered. Methodical destruction fire had reduced German strongpoints to rubble, while interdiction fire had cut communication lines and supply routes. The ridge's surface had been transformed into a moonscape of interlocking shell craters. But beneath the apparent chaos lay a carefully orchestrated plan. Captain William Milne, of the 16th Battalion, moved through the tunnels beneath no man's land, marveling at the engineering achievement that had made their approach possible. The Grange subway alone stretched nearly 2 miles toward German lines, allowing an entire battalion to advance within striking distance of enemy trenches without suffering a single casualty from defensive fire. The tunnel system represented months of backbreaking labor by Canadian engineers and mining specialists recruited from the coal fields of Nova Scotia and Alberta, working in 12-hour shifts. They had excavated over 40,000 cubic yards of earth and rock, creating an underground highway that would deliver the assault troops directly to their jumping-off positions, intelligence reports, compiled from prisoner interrogations and aerial reconnaissance, indicated that the preliminary bombardment had achieved its primary objectives. According to captured documents from the German 6th Army headquarters, Crown Prince Ruprecht had acknowledged that his forward positions were barely sustainable. Constant shelling had made resupply nearly impossible, and many German strong points were being held by skeleton crews of demoralized troops. As detailed in accounts from the Imperial War Museums, the Canadian approach to battle preparation represented a revolutionary departure from traditional military doctrine. Rather than relying on courage and elan to overcome defensive positions, the Canadians had applied industrial efficiency and scientific method to the art of war. Every aspect of the assault had been planned, rehearsed, and refined until it approached. Mechanical precision. Lieutenant Colonel Currie gathered his company commanders for a final briefing in the headquarters bunker. The attack would begin at 0530 hours on Easter Monday, April 9th, with the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Canadian Divisions advancing simultaneously across a 4-mile front. Each division had been assigned specific objectives, with timing calculated to the minute and artillery support coordinated to provide maximum effectiveness. The 1st Division, under Major General Currie, would assault the northern section of the ridge, targeting the village of Thelis and the surrounding high ground. The 2nd Division, commanded by Major General Henry Burstall, would advance against the center, aiming for the Thelisivy Road in the German second line. The 3rd Division, under Major General Louis Lipset, faced the strongest German positions around the village of Vimy itself. The 4th Division, led by Major General David Watson, had the most challenging assignment, capturing the supposedly impregnable Hill 145. The weather had been unseasonably cold for early April, the intermittent snow squalls that provided additional concealment for the final preparations. Canadian troops had spent the week before the assault in intensive training behind the lines, practicing their attacks on replica German trenches that engineers had constructed based on aerial photographs and prisoner intelligence. Unlike previous offensives that had relied on massive waves of infantry charging across open ground, the Canadian plan called for small, highly trained assault groups to advance in short rushes, using shell craters and terrain features for cover. Each section had been assigned specific objectives and given the tactical flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances. As the hour of attack approached, the preliminary bombardment reached its climax. The systematic destruction that had characterized the previous week gave way to a final hurricane of fire that lasted 3 minutes and concentrated the firepower of nearly 1,000 guns on the German front lines. Then, at precisely 0-5-20-7 hours, the guns lifted their fire and began the creeping barrage that would guide the Canadian infantry to their destiny. The earth trembled as if the world itself were coming apart when the creeping barrage began at 0530 hours on Easter Monday, April 9th, 1917. Through the pre-dawn darkness, 4 divisions of Canadian infantry emerged from their tunnels and assembly trenches like phantoms, materializing from the underworld. Private James Robertson of the 24th Battalion felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he climbed the wooden ladder from the Grange subway. The carefully planned timetable that had seemed so precise during rehearsals now dissolved into the chaos of battle. Snow was falling steadily, driven by a bitter wind that cut through his wool greatcoat and made his hands numb despite the thick gloves. The creeping barrage moved forward at a rate of exactly 100 yards every 3 minutes, creating a wall of exploding shells that advanced just ahead of the infantry. Lieutenant Colonel Curry had drilled this timing into every man. Stay close enough to the barrage to reach German positions before the defenders could emerge from their shelters, but not so close as to be caught by their own artillery. On the northern flank, the 1st Division's assault battalions moved forward through the swirling snow and smoke. The 18th Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Betty, encountered their first German strongpoint within minutes of leaving their trenches. The preliminary bombardment had collapsed part of the concrete bunker, but machine gun fire still raked the approaches from firing ports cut into the reinforced walls. Sergeant William Johnstone crawled forward through the mud and wire, carrying a satchel of Mills bombs. The tactical innovations that the Canadians had developed during months of preparation now proved their worth. Instead of frontal assault, small groups of experienced soldiers used infiltration tactics to work around strong points, attacking from unexpected directions while the main force provided covering fire. The German defenders, many of them from the 1st Guard Reserve Division, fought with desperate courage despite the devastating effects of the week-long bombardment. Machine gun crews emerged from their shelters to find the battlefield transformed into an alien. The landscape of overlapping shell craters filled with freezing water and debris. Communication lines had been severed, making coordinated defense nearly impossible. Major General Curry, advancing with his divisional headquarters, received reports that the first objectives were being captured ahead of schedule. The village of Thelis, which had been expected to resist for hours, fell to the 24th Battalion within 40 minutes of the assault's beginning. The combination of precise artillery fire and skilled infantry tactics had achieved what 2 years of previous attacks had failed to accomplish, according to accounts preserved in the Canadian National Archives. The success of the assault's opening phases exceeded even the most optimistic projections. The 2nd Division, advancing through the center of the ridge, had broken through the German first line at multiple points and was pushing toward the intermediate objectives that controlled the approaches to the main ridgeline. The 3rd Division faced the most difficult terrain, attacking upslope against positions that the Germans had spent months fortifying. The village of Vimy itself sat astride the ridge's crest, its ruins transformed into a fortress bristling with machine gun positions and observation posts. Lieutenant Colonel William Ray, commanding the 42nd Battalion, led his men through a maze of communication trenches and shell craters, using the cover of the creeping barrage to approach positions that had been considered impregnable. The 4th Division, signed to capture Hill 145, encountered the fiercest resistance. The German defenders, recognizing the tactical importance of this dominating height, had constructed multiple lines of defense connected by deep tunnels that had survived the preliminary bombardment. Major General Watson's assault battalions found themselves engaged in brutal close quarters, fighting as they worked their way from crater to crater toward the summit. Private Mackenzie, advancing with the 42nd Battalion, stumbled through the mud and wire toward a German machine gun position that continued firing despite the approaching barrage. The lessons learned during months of training now guided his actions automatically. He worked his way around the position's flank while his section leader provided covering fire, then closed the distance with a final rush that brought him within throwing range. The Mills bomb exploded inside the concrete emplacement, silencing the machine gun and clearing the way for the following waves. Such small unit actions, repeated hundreds of times across the 4-mile front, gradually reduced the German defensive system to isolated pockets of resistance. By mid-morning, 3 of the 4 Canadian divisions had achieved their initial objectives. and were consolidating their gains while artillery observers established new firing positions. The ridge's reverse slope lay spread below them, revealing the network of supply roads and communication trenches that had sustained the German defense. For the first time in over 2 years, Allied forces looked down from Vimy Ridge toward the WWII Plain, and the strategic balance on the Western Front had shifted irrevocably. The battle for Hill 145 had become a nightmare of mud, blood, and broken stone that tested the limits of human endurance. By noon on April 9th, while the other 3 Canadian divisions were consolidating their remarkable gains, the 4th Division found itself locked in the most vicious fighting of the entire Vimy offensive. Major General David Watson crouched in a captured German bunker, studying reports that painted a grim picture of the assault's progress. The 44th Battalion had suffered severe casualties, attempting to storm the hill's northern approaches, while the 46th Battalion was pinned down by interlocking machine gun fire from positions that had somehow survived the week-long bombardment. The German defenders, primarily from the 1st Guard Reserve Division's elite companies, had transformed Hill 145 into a fortress within a fortress. Lieutenant Colonel Fritz von Lausberg, the German defensive specialist, had personally supervised the construction of a system of mutually supporting strongpoints, connected by deep tunnels carved into the limestone bedrock. When the Canadian artillery lifted its fire, German machine gunners emerged from these underground shelters to find excellent fields of fire across the approaches. Lieutenant Robert Shankland of the 43rd Battalion led his company through a communication trench that had been blasted into an unrecognizable jumble of concrete and twisted steel. The preliminary bombardment had achieved its primary purpose of cutting wire and destroying surface installations, but the deeper German positions remained largely intact. Each advance of 50 yards required careful coordination between rifle sections, Lewis gun teams, and grenade throwers. The fighting had evolved into a series of individual battles for specific strongpoints, each defended by determined German soldiers who understood the tactical importance of their position. From Hill 145, artillery observers could direct fire across the entire Canadian rear area, making consolidation of the ridge's gains impossible. The hill had to be taken regardless of cost. Private William Milne, a farm boy from Saskatchewan, found himself crawling through a shell crater toward a German machine gun position that had already claimed a dozen casualties from his platoon. The tactical innovations that had served the Canadians so well in the morning assault now required adaptation to the close-quarters fighting that characterized the hill's defenses, as documented in records from the Canadian War Museum. The capture of Hill 145 represented the culmination of everything the Canadian Corps had learned about modern warfare. The combination of individual initiative, small unit tactics, and coordinated fire support that had been developed during months of preparation now faced its ultimate test against an enemy fighting with the desperation of cornered men, the German machine gun position occupied a concrete emplacement that commanded the approaches from 3 directions. Sergeant Major John McGregor, a veteran of the Second Boer War, organized a classic fire-and movement attack that used the terrain's natural features to approach the position from its blind side. 2 Lewis gun teams provided covering fire while a rifle section worked its way around the emplacement's flank. The assault required precise timing and absolute trust between soldiers who had trained together for months. When the covering fire lifted, the attacking section had exactly 30 seconds to cover the final 20 yards before the machine gun could be brought to bear on their position. Private Milne sprinted across the open ground, his bayonet fixed and his rifle ready. His German grenades exploded around him. The fighting for individual positions often lasted hours, advantages shifting back and forth as fresh troops were fed into the battle. The German defenders had the benefit of prepared positions and interior lines of communication, but the Canadians possessed superior tactical flexibility and the psychological advantage of attacking troops, who sensed victory within their grasp. Major Thomas Scudamore, commanding the 46th Battalion's assault companies, established his command post in a captured German bunker that still contained the bodies of its former occupants. The concrete walls were 2 feet thick, designed to withstand direct hits from heavy artillery. but the interior had been wrecked by the explosion of Canadian shells that had found the ventilation system by late afternoon. The 4th Division had advanced to within 200 yards of Hill 145's summit, but the final approaches were swept by concentrated fire from the remaining German positions. The tactical situation required a coordinated assault that would overwhelm the defenders before they could bring their remaining weapons to bear. Lieutenant Colonel Watson gathered his battalion commanders for a final conference as the afternoon light began to fade. The assault would begin at 1600 hours, with all available artillery concentrated on the hill's remaining strong points. The 4th Division had come too far and sacrificed too much to accept anything less than complete victory. The stage was set for the climactic battle that would determine whether the Canadian Corps could achieve its most challenging objective and complete one of the most remarkable military achievements in the history of warfare. The final assault on Hill 145 began at 1600 hours with a concentrated artillery barrage that seemed to shake the Earth's foundations. Every available gun in the Canadian Corps had been turned on the hill's remaining strongpoints, creating a storm of high explosive and shrapnel that transformed the summit into a hellscape of smoke and flying debris. Lieutenant Robert Shankland led his company of the 43rd Battalion up the hill's western slope, using shell craters and debris for cover as they advanced toward the German positions. The enemy's return fire had slackened considerably since the morning, but isolated. Machine gun positions still commanded key approaches to the summit. Each yard of ground had to be won through careful coordination between rifle sections and Lewis gun teams. The German defenders, reduced to perhaps 50 men from their original garrison of over 200, fought with the desperate courage of soldiers who knew they were making their last stand. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, commanding the remnants of the 1st Guard Reserve Division's 3rd Company, had established his final position in a concrete bunker near the hill's crest. From this vantage point, he could direct the fire of his remaining machine guns and coordinate the defense of the approaches. Private William Milne, advancing with the leading section, reached the edge of the final crater system that surrounded the German command post. The preliminary bombardment had created a maze of interlocking shell holes, each potentially containing enemy soldiers with rifles and grenades. The tactical problem required individual initiative and small unit coordination that had been perfected during months of training. Sergeant Major McGregor organized the final assault with the methodical precision that had characterized Canadian operations throughout the battle. 2 rifle sections would advance from the north, while a Lewis gun team provided covering fire from a flanking position. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and the assault would be caught in the open. Too late, and the defenders would have time to reorganize their position. According to historical accounts preserved in the Canadian National Archives, the final fighting for Hill 145 demonstrated the evolution of infantry tactics that had taken place during the first years of the Great War. The massed attacks that had characterized the early battles had given way to small unit operations that emphasized individual skill and tactical flexibility. The German machine gun position occupied a reinforced concrete emplacement that had survived the preliminary bombardment despite taking several direct hits. The weapons crew, reduced to 2 men, maintained disciplined fire that swept the approaches and made direct assault nearly impossible. The tactical solution required the kind of innovative thinking that had become the hallmark of Canadian operations. Lieutenant Shankland identified a communication trench that had been partially collapsed by shell fire, but still provided covered access to the German position's blind side. Leading a small assault group, he worked his way through the debris-filled excavation while his supporting sections maintained covering fire. The approach required nearly an hour of careful movement through unstable ground that could collapse at any moment. The final assault began at 1700 hours as the afternoon light faded toward evening. Canadian soldiers emerged from their concealed positions and advanced across the final 100 yards of open ground with the disciplined precision of men who had rehearsed every movement. The German defenders, recognizing the inevitable outcome, continued firing until their ammunition was exhausted. Private Milne reached the German machine gun position first, his bayonet fixed and his rifle ready for close combat. The weapons crew, 2 young soldiers who looked barely old enough to be in uniform, raised their hands in surrender as the Canadian soldiers surrounded their position. The psychological impact of the week-long bombardment and the relentless infantry assault had finally broken the defenders' will to resist. Hauptmann Weber, emerging from his command bunker with a white flag improvised from a torn undershirt, formally surrendered the hill's remaining defenders at 17:30 hours. The German officer, a veteran of the Eastern Front, who had been decorated for his defense of other impossible positions, acknowledged the tactical superiority of the Canadian assault with professional respect. The capture of Hill 145 completed the Canadian Corps' conquest of Vimy Ridge, but the victory had been purchased at a significant cost. The 4th Division alone had suffered over 800 casualties during the two-day battle, while the entire operation had cost the Canadian Corps over 10,000 men killed, wounded, and missing. Major General Watson, surveying the battlefield from the captured summit, could see the WWII plain stretching away toward the horizon. For the first time in over 2 years, Allied forces controlled the dominating high ground that had been the key to German defensive strategy in this sector. The tactical and strategic implications of the victory would reshape the conduct of the Great War. As darkness fell over the battlefield, Canadian soldiers began the grim task of consolidating their gains, while medical personnel worked to evacuate the wounded. The Battle of Vimy Ridge had ended in complete victory, but the human cost served as a sobering reminder of the price of military success in the industrial age. The dawn of April 10th, 1917 revealed the full extent of the Canadian Corps' extraordinary achievement. From the captured German observation posts atop Vimy Ridge, Lieutenant Colonel Currie could see the entire DOA plain spread below him like a detailed military map. The strategic high ground that had cost the French and British over 100,000 casualties in previous attempts now flew the Canadian flag. The German withdrawal from the ridge had been conducted with typical Prussian efficiency during the night hours. Crown Prince Ruprecht's remaining forces had abandoned their carefully prepared secondary positions and fallen back to the Oppe-Maricourt line, nearly 5 miles to the east. The retreat represented the first significant German withdrawal on the Western Front since the stabilization of the trench system in 1914. Captain William Milne, now serving as a temporary company commander after his unit's heavy casualties, supervised the consolidation of the newly captured positions. The German defensive system, viewed from the inside, revealed the sophistication of the engineering that had made the ridge so formidable. Concrete bunkers connected by deep communication trenches had created a fortress that might have resisted attack indefinitely. Under different circumstances, the Canadian success had been achieved through a combination of meticulous preparation, tactical innovation, and individual courage that represented a new standard in military operations. Unlike the hurried, poorly coordinated attacks that had characterized much of the Great War, the Vimy assault had been planned and executed with scientific precision that left nothing to chance. British Field Marshal Douglas Haig, visiting the battlefield on April 11th, expressed his amazement at the thoroughness of the Canadian achievement. The capture of the entire ridge in a single coordinated assault had exceeded the most optimistic projections and demonstrated the effectiveness of the tactical methods that Lieutenant General Byng and his divisional commanders had developed. According to reports filed by war correspondents from London newspapers, the international reaction to the Canadian victory was one of astonishment and admiration. The Dominion forces, previously regarded as competent but unremarkable colonial troops, had accomplished what the regular armies of 2 major European powers had failed to achieve. The psychological impact of the success resonated far beyond its immediate tactical significance. The consolidation phase revealed the true scope of the German defensive preparations. Canadian engineers discovered an underground network of tunnels, ammunition dumps, and command posts that had taken months to construct. The main tunnel system extended over 3 miles and contained accommodations for an entire regiment, complete with electric lighting and ventilation systems. Private Robertson, detailed to help with the prisoner processing, was struck by the youth and exhaustion of the German soldiers who had defended the ridge. Many were teenagers who had been conscripted from the industrial cities of the Ruhr Valley, while others were veteran soldiers who had fought on the Eastern Front. Before being transferred to the supposedly quiet sector around Vimy, the German Casualties had been surprisingly light considering the intensity of the fighting. The week-long preliminary bombardment had forced most of the defenders to remain in their deep shelters, and the speed of the Canadian advance had prevented the kind of prolonged resistance that typically characterized trench warfare. Total German losses were estimated at fewer than 4,000 men, including prisoners. The Canadian Corps' own casualties, while significant, were far lower than those suffered in comparable operations. The total loss of 10,602 men, including 3,598 killed, represented a remarkably efficient exchange ratio for such a complex assault. The careful preparation and tactical innovations had minimized the human cost while maximizing the strategic results. Major General Currie, now promoted to command the Canadian Corps following Lieutenant General Byng's elevation to Army Command, established his headquarters in the former German command bunker beneath Hill 145. The concrete structure, designed to withstand direct hits from heavy artillery, would serve as the nerve center for Canadian operations in the sector. The intelligence gathered from captured documents and prisoner interrogations revealed the broader implications of the German withdrawal. The loss of Vimy Ridge had compromised the entire German defensive system in northern France, forcing a strategic reassessment that would influence German planning for the remainder of the war. As the first week after the battle drew to a close, the Canadian Corps began receiving reinforcements and supplies that would enable them to exploit their success. The logistical achievement of maintaining 4 divisions in their advanced positions represented another aspect of the meticulous planning that had characterized the entire operation. The Battle of Vimy Ridge had established the Canadian Corps as an elite formation capable of achieving objectives that had defeated other forces, but the broader implications of the victory extended far beyond military considerations. The young Dominion of Canada had announced its presence on the world stage in the most dramatic way possible. The news of the Canadian victory at Vimy Ridge reached the home front through telegraph cables that carried reports of unprecedented success on the Western Front, in cities and towns across the Dominion. From Halifax to Vancouver, church bells rang, and crowds gathered in the streets to celebrate. What newspapers were already calling Canada's Easter gift to the Empire. Prime Minister Robert Borden, reading the initial reports in his East Bloc office, recognized immediately that the Battle of Vimy Ridge represented far more than a military victory. For the first time in the nation's 50-year history, Canadian forces had achieved a success that belonged uniquely to Canada. Fought under Canadian command and planned by Canadian generals who had proven themselves the equals of any military leaders. In the world, the 4 divisions that had stormed the ridge represented every region of the young country. The Prairie Provinces had contributed the bulk of the 4th Division, while Ontario and Quebec had provided the core of the 1st and 2nd Divisions. The Maritime Provinces, despite their smaller population, had supplied entire battalions that had distinguished themselves in the fighting. Lieutenant Colonel Currie, now elevated to command the Canadian Corps, stood once again atop Hill 145 and contemplated the significance of what his forces had achieved. The tactical and strategic importance of the victory was undeniable, but the psychological impact on Canadian national consciousness would prove even more profound. The Dominion had found its voice on the world stage through the courage and skill of its soldiers. The international reaction to the Canadian success had been immediate and overwhelming. The London Times, in an editorial published on April 15th, proclaimed that the capture of Vimy Ridge by Canadian forces represents one of the most brilliant military achievements of the war. Similar praise came from newspapers across the Allied nations, establishing Canada's reputation as a formidable military power. War correspondent Philip Gibbs, writing from the captured German positions, described the scene in terms that captured the historical significance of the moment. Standing on the crest of Vimy Ridge, looking out over the Douai plain that had been closed to Allied eyes for 2.5 years, one cannot help but feel that this represents a turning point not only in the war, but in the history of the British Empire. The German reaction to the loss of Vimy Ridge revealed the strategic importance of the Canadian achievement. Crown Prince Ruprecht, in his private war diary, acknowledged that the fall of the ridge had fundamentally altered the military situation in northern France. The German High Command was forced to revise its defensive strategy and commit additional reserves to prevent further Allied advances. Back in Canada, the Victory Parade in Ottawa on April 22nd drew the largest crowd in the capital's history. Veterans of the Northwest Rebellion and the Second Boer War marched alongside families of men serving overseas, united in pride for the achievement of Canadian arms. The Dominion had proven that it could stand alongside the great powers of the world. The tactical innovations developed for the Vimy assault would influence military doctrine for the remainder of the war and beyond. The combination of detailed intelligence gathering, coordinated artillery support, and flexible infantry tactics became the model for successful operations on the Western Front. Military academies would study the Canadian methods for decades to come. Private Mackenzie, recovering from wounds received in the final assault on Hill 145, wrote to his family in New Brunswick describing the transformation he had witnessed in his fellow soldiers. "We went up that ridge as boys from different provinces," he wrote, "but we came down as Canadians. Something changed in us during those 4 days that I don't think we fully understand yet." The political implications of the victory extended beyond military considerations. Success at Vimy Ridge strengthened Canada's position in the Imperial War Cabinet and provided Prime Minister Borden with the leverage he needed to secure separate Canadian representation at the eventual peace conference. The Dominion had earned its place at the table of nations through the blood and sacrifice of its soldiers. As summer arrived and the front stabilized along the new German defensive lines, the Canadian Corps continued to build on the reputation established at Vimy Ridge. The tactical expertise and fighting spirit demonstrated in the April assault would carry them through subsequent battles at Hill 70. Pastiendel, the final campaigns of 1918. The legacy of Vimy Ridge would resonate through Canadian history long after the guns fell silent. The ridge became a symbol of national achievement and sacrifice, representing the moment when 4 provinces became a nation in the crucible of war. The victory belonged not to the British Empire or the Allied cause, but to Canada itself. Purchased with Canadian blood and planned by Canadian minds. On April 9th, 1917, the Dominion of Canada had announced its presence to the world, and the echo of that announcement would shape the nation's identity for generations to come. The young country that had entered the war as a colonial appendage emerged from the smoke and chaos of Vimy Ridge as a sovereign nation. Forged in battle and tempered by sacrifice,